Imagine a world where you knew that you mattered and you belonged. The people cared about you because we were so darn good at listening to one another, no matter how different we are. That is what Sidewalk Talk is doing by putting listeners on sidewalks all over the world so that we can practice the art of connecting. Join me, founder and director Tracy Rubel, as I interview experts on the fine art of human connection and interview some of our volunteers who've been listening on the sidewalk and even some of the folks that we've listened to. And if you want to volunteer, consider joining us at sidewalk-talk.org. Hi, Dr. Shelly Harrell. I'm so excited to have you here. And I want to give you a funny story about how I heard you speak. I heard you speak at the UCLA IP&B conference several years ago on the interpersonal neurobiology of culture and diversity. And it was a really complicated conference in many ways because I had several colleagues of color that wanted to come to the conference. And they said, but we're not going to go because there are no people of color on the speaking panels. And so on the back end, we kind of spoke up and said, you got to make some changes to that panel. You can't have a conference on that. And you were a bright light in the middle of a really potent conference with a lot of provocation. And so that stuck with me. And that's why I reached out to you to interview you.
Well, I'm glad that you did. I appreciate it. And just happy to hear of your work and this Sidewalk Talk project.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I don't want to give you the introduction. I would like for you to sort of educate us on what got you started, what do you do, and what got you started? You know, share a little bit of that vulnerable first start.
Yes. Well, I am a psychologist. I focus on, in my work, culture and diversity, and with a real commitment to making what we do in terms of psychological services more inclusive, more relevant, more appropriate, less biased, and so that we do can be disseminated in a way that can be received and helpful to others, both at the individual level. So individual distress, as well as the relational and collective levels. So I believe that psychology has the potential to impact not just individual lives, but our collective lives. And of course, all of those levels of analysis are related to each other, who we are, internally, our awareness, what's in our field of awareness, our beliefs, our biases, all of those things impact our relationships and how we relate to people. And that impacts then how we are in the world and the kinds of things that get enacted, both positively and unfortunately negatively in our world. So I believe in the power of this work. But in graduate school, I was in graduate school in the 80s, there was like nothing. I think the first book on multicultural, or I think at that time it was called Minority Mental Health or something like that, came out in 1980.
I remember.
And so, but this was I came into graduate school very, very interested. And that kind of grew out of my life. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, in a African American neighborhood, in sort of the center of Detroit. And but I went to a private school in the suburbs of Detroit and took a bus out there every day. Went to a very wealthy private school, and so being in these white spaces and the numerous both micro and macroaggressions that I experienced from childhood on really sensitized me to diversity issues. And it kind of lit a fire that, something needs to be done about this on a number of levels. I grew up during the civil rights movement. The civil unrest in Detroit, Michigan in the mid-'60s was right in my community. There's still buildings burned down on a street a couple blocks from me that since 67, 68 have not been repaired.
Wow.
And so the collective sort of level of analysis, what happens when we ignore and exclude and dismiss and marginalize people, I feel very committed to that level of analysis as well. So both my own personal experiences, and some of those, not all of those have been negative. I had a very healing experience in fourth grade at a private school that I was at, where a little boy called me the N word, and it was very hurtful to me. I actually told the teacher, and the teacher reported it to the headmaster and headmistress, and they acted on this. And this was probably late 60s, early 70s, this would have been. And it turns out the headmaster and headmistress were Holocaust survivors. And so they had a significant commitment to not having any kind of ism in their school. And so I also learned early that people who did not look like me could attend to my feelings and my concerns and my needs and be responsive. So it was this mix in these environments I was in of both very painful and hurtful and exclusionary experience, very othering experiences, as well as some healing and connecting experiences. And so that has also given me the fire to say this can be different. People can respond in ways that are humanizing and inclusive. So that was a very long answer to your question.
I think it's an important answer to the question, because one of the things that I admired in hearing you, and for folks that are listening, I do think it's worth going to your personal website. There's some really important documentation. I love you have some pieces, certainly excerpts from books you've written, but there's some actual information that's laid out visually in a way where you can kind of understand the different pillars of context. And what I think you do well is you help us identify all these different contexts in which bias operates, and in which we are sort of interacting with each other and maybe not fully aware of the full range of context that we need to be thinking about. And I feel like by you sharing that story, you're kind of giving us the larger context of you, and what shapes you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I can't say, Dr. Harrell, that I knew all that was going to happen when I started Sidewalk Talk. Its inspiration came out of a just sort of outrage at the result of the Trayvon Martin case. That's really what ultimately engaged this project. And for me, I didn't feel like I was educated enough in social justice, so I thought it would be important for me to just sit on a sidewalk and keep my mouth shut and just listen, and that was the right way for me to protest. But along the way, there have been some positives and negatives, right? That I've been informed by context, and I really like your feedback on it. Number one, listening like this is really great for improving implicit bias, right? Because we listen to so many different kinds of people.
Absolutely.
But number two, boy, can you bring some pretty crappy saviorism into the picture, right? Which to me, it sounds like my internet's slow. Saviorism comes into the picture, which is another manifestation of power. And so I guess I wanted to ask your advice for all of our listeners. How can we be better listeners and indict and open ourselves to these different implicit biases that might come up for us in a way that's contemplative, kind, that is resourcing for us so that we can continue to do the work?
Yes. And I am sorry for the noise outside the window. Of course, the time we're going to do the interview is the time that the trucks decide to.
You know what? I interviewed Rick Hansen last week, and he had a construction crew outside of his house. So you're in good company.
Exactly. So, kind of to get back to your question, I think, one of the things that we have to sort of really kind of hold is the simultaneity of these different levels of both identity and just kind of human existence. And really, I always think about this really old quote by Kluckhohn and Murray, who are anthropologists, and I'm going to paraphrase it. And the quote goes something like this: "We are simultaneously like all others, like no others, and like some others." Mm-hmm. And I think, we have trouble holding all of those things at the same time. Mm-hmm. So we will sort of go into a universality. We are all the same, color blindness, which renders others invisible right?
Mm-hmm.
So when someone says to me something like, "Well, I don't see you as Black. I don't see you as African American," I'm like, "Well, what do you see?" You know, and it sort of gives the message that I am not that you are not willing to hear all of my experience. You are not take in my lived experience in its entirety, that you want to kind of leave a part of. And so at the same time, that piece of we are like all others is absolutely necessary. Absolutely necessary. We do need to transcend difference. We do need to be able to connect to our shared humanity, to this human journey we're all on that involves struggles and vulnerabilities and triumphs as well, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so holding those kind of three dimensions simultaneously, holding our common humanity. Also, you know, the we are like no others, the uniqueness, the absolute uniqueness of every single
Mm-hmm.
human being on the planet, that we cannot, you know, fall into overgeneralizing, that
Mm-hmm.
we must see the uniqueness of each person's story. You know,
Right.
and then there's that third piece, and that's where we get kind of tripped up, which is we are like some others, which is our groupness, and that's where difference comes in, and that's where, you know, we our separateness in some ways gets highlighted. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so group differences show up in culture, show up in ways that groups are treated differently in society.
Yeah.
Shows up in historical events, historical traumas, collective traumas that we bring into current micro relationships and what we carry. Our groupness shows up in various ways. You know, we need connectedness, we need similarity, we need to look at someone else and say, "Ooh, you know, you get me, you get my lived experience," and that is healing and helpful. And we need those spaces where we can exhale, you know, where
Mm-hmm.
we're not defended and concerned about being rendered invisible or being dehumanized in some way. So those group spaces are so important, but we have trouble with groupness, you know. And the other end of groupness, of course, is how we pathologize, marginalize, stigmatize, and the fundamental issue is dehumanize people who are not like us. So that dynamic
Mm-hmm.
is there in the groupness as well. So all three of these levels we need to hold simultaneously, both in terms of their potential for connecting us, as
Mm-hmm.
well as their potential for dividing us. And again, I go back to what I said at all levels of analysis,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's the intrapersonal manifestations, the interpersonal, right? Those micro encounters we have where, you know, we're interacting with someone and something gets said and all kinds of activation happens and all of the differences just begin to kind of flow into the space between us.
Yeah.
As well as on the societal level, where all of these things manifest in terms, unfortunately, of social injustices, historical traumas, genocide, slavery, colonization, et cetera, that have severely harmed us as a planet and as a people, a collective
Mm-hmm.
people, in terms of our potential to really, you know, kind of do well
Yeah.
for each other and for the world. So I'd like to start with that because the challenge of intergroup or intercultural relationships and listening is the challenge of holding those three things simultaneously and not kind of just being in the, you know, we are all the same mode, or focusing so much on our differences that we aren't able to connect meaningfully in terms of our shared humanity. So that's sort of the foundation. I think, you
Mm-hmm.
know, another piece that sort of feeds into that is that difference is hard, whether we're talking about an you know, a
Yeah.
couple. In my practice, I'm a therapist as well. In my practice, I specialize in seeing couples. Now, so I have this work that I do. You do too. Okay. So I have this work that I do that is sort of, you know, diversity work, anti-racism work. My research has been looking at racism-related stress. It's been looking at, you know, making our interventions more culturally competent, more working with people on cultural humility. And but to me, those are just different levels of analysis, because ultimately in relationships, we're trying to balance the me and the we. We're trying to balance the individual and our relationship. We're trying to manage our differences with somebody and form a unit and sustain and strengthen this unit when we have differences. And that relational level of analysis is not so different from social and societal and macrosystemic levels of analysis. And of course, there's more complexities at increasingly complex levels. But we, as a kind of human species, we have trouble with differences. We react physiologically to different racial faces. There's all kinds of research just on our basic challenges with difference. So I think another important thing for those of us who value these kinds of encounters where we want to connect across differences really need to do some internal work to interrogate how am I dealing with, how do I respond to difference, right? What are the ways that I react to difference? And I think there's some fundamental ways that are normative that we're all going to do something with anxiety at different rates. And so about, sometimes we deny difference, minimize the difference in some way. Sometimes we devalue the other, in an attempt to feel okay and manage our own anxiety. Distancing is another sort of very common reaction to difference. And distancing can happen, certainly physically. We choose to live apart very often. We choose to live with others who look like ourselves. A psychologist that I have a lot of respect for, Beverly Daniel Tatum, wrote a book called "Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's really about that need we have for affirmation that's so important, and belonging and sense of connectedness,
Mm-hmm.
but also how we can protect ourselves. There's a protective function that it serves as well, and we need to realize when are we distancing, and distancing happens emotionally. I think about pity, and you mentioned the word saviorism earlier when we were talking, and I think of pity as an emotionally distancing phenomena. That when we're in a place of pity, we're putting ourselves, so apart from the other, so to speak, and looking down on them. And pity is kind of a condescending way of distancing. Another psychologist that I just love her work, Lillian Comos Diaz, anthropologist syndrome, where another way we distance from difference is, it's so fascinating, it's so interesting. We put people sort of on this little exhibit to be, observed and analyzed, and that's very distancing. It's very objectifying. We're not, connecting human to human, soul to soul, heart to heart, where we're seeing the other as fascinating and interesting, and as a museum object almost. So I think these are, ways that are actually very normative. So what we have to become sensitized to is tuning into our own reactive difference and what happens, and where it's starting to emerge. Do we get defensive and need to defend our values and say, but I'm not racist, or I'm not prejudiced, that's not my value system? And do we get stuck in that defensiveness? Are we distancing? Are we kind of denying and minimizing? We're all the same, it's all good, and are we devaluing? What are we doing? And so that pull to both tolerate the coexistence of the sameness and differentness and all others, no others, some others, as well as tuning into our own reactivity to difference, which is human and natural. It's not a sin. But if we're going to have meaningful interactions across differences, we need to be aware of our own reactivity.
So I'm going to reflect back what you just said, and then I'm going to ask a question, because I think that there's some bullet points that I want to highlight that you just said, because I think they're so important. And I'm noticing in my own body, I'm like, oh, I do that. I do that too. And
As do I. I think we all, we all
and
do.
and I think what I've developed is a certain kind of resilience so that I can say that without swimming in shame, right? That's been the most important part of the work, because if my shame takes over, then
Yes.
that's distancing too.
Mm-hmm,
Right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, so you said, look, we physiologically do react to difference.
Yes.
Um, we have a hard time with difference, and it comes up by the way we might devalue someone, distance from them, by try to say we are all just one, by decreasing the idea that there's even any difference at all, by pitying someone, and by objectifying them, by kind of putting them on a, like they're in a petri dish and we're examining it.
Right. Right.
And then you said, and so what we need to do to overcome this, to create, and I share this ideal that I think the evolution of our species is going to be about how do we move from that me to that we, so that we're holding the self and the other, and that's the way our brain needs to evolve for the planet to survive, frankly. Um, what I want to ask you about, how do we begin to change the brain and the body and the nervous system's reaction to difference? Because I had this just a quick story,
Mhm.
Shelly. On vacation this year, I have two sons, and one
I
of
do
them,
too.
you do. Mine are 18 months apart, and I'm a fiery woman, so they really annoy the crap out of me sometimes.
Right.
um, on vacation, one of them sent me this email prior to, he went ahead to stay with grandma and grandpa, who are foreign, and he sent me an email about Wonder Woman and sort of picking on Wonder Woman. And so when I showed up, I said, hey, can I have a talk with you about that email? Like, you're like a white dude. You have like a gazillion superheroes, and I have one. Right? Like, what was that about? Because it actually really hurt my feelings.
Mhm.
And we had this whole conversation, my 10-year-old, about implicit bias. And he
Mhm.
immediately had all the reactions. He says, are you telling me that I'm sexist? Right? And I said,
Right.
well, I'm not saying that you're sexist, but I think that maybe your brain has been shaped to sort of say that the male superheroes are just the real deal and the female superheroes aren't. And
Mhm.
that's called implicit bias. And so we talked about it for a long time. And his response to me was this: oh my God, mama, this is a real problem, what you're saying. And most people, when you try to talk to them about this stuff, they're going to feel like you're accusing them of something. You've got to figure out a simpler way to talk about this. I'm like, I don't know.
Wisdom of a 10-year-old, right?
So I guess I wanted to find out, how can we begin to work this inside of ourselves in a meaningful way?
Yeah, yeah. So a couple of things come to mind. One is there's, we've got to increase our tolerance for discomfort and
Mm,
not bail.
yeah,
We have to be willing to sustain engagement with difference. We
yeah,
have to be willing to sustain engagement with others, with the feelings that come up in ourselves, to sustain engagement with those long enough to breathe through them,
mm,
and step back and understand what's going on, give ourselves some compassion, as you talked about with the shame, being able to now, acknowledge it, and not necessarily become so immersed in it that it prevents you from connecting.
right.
So I think it's those, in some ways, starting at that basic sort of individual level of what's happening with me, and let me be more aware of that,
Mm,
and using that as a foundation to get to a place where we can then engage the work of challenging some of these biases
mm,
that are part of this kind of system of structural or systemic oppression
mm,
in multiple dimensions, whether we're talking gender, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, immigration status, etc. We do the sort of individual and relational forms of oppression, interpersonal, intrapersonal, build up and contribute and sustain and collude with the maintenance of the status quo of systemic oppression and institutionalized isms,
mm,
such that we see differences, like you mentioned, like all the superheroes are, well, not all, the vast majority of superheroes are male, right?
And white.
And white, and white.
Or green sometimes.
Right. Well, yeah, they will vary in colors, but they're often not brown.
That's right.
They may be blue, they may be green, but brown is not too common. So that's it. That's where we see these systemic differences by
Right.
gender, by race, by ethnicity. Whether we're looking at economics, education, health outcomes is something obviously I pay a lot of attention to. There are disparities, and
That's right.
so the micro of our interactions and what we choose to allow into our field of awareness and pay attention to in ourselves, in our interactions with people in society, show up in how society operates.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think, the all levels of analysis are important to attend to. But I think the act of, working with one's own process enough to be able to engage and attune with what's going on with another and sustain that engagement in the act of listening is powerful because it serves as a building block for healing things at higher levels of analysis, right? So when people disengage and don't sustain engagement long enough to really hear the whole story of another, we often listen for part stories, or we listen to what fits in our already open files in our brain, and we have to sustain engagement long enough to maybe open a new file and not just put the information in the old files and where it fits with what we already think. And that involves intentionality and sort of purposeful checking in with oneself, being attuned to the other, and then being aware at that kind of sociopolitical level of how external, historical, current sociopolitical factors are kind of omnipresent in all of the other levels of analysis.
Right.
So again, it's holding a bunch of stuff simultaneously and moving back and forth through individual, relational, societal, macro, and how all of those interact with each other. So, the act of listening is listening to all of those levels of analysis.
Yeah.
It's listening, intrapersonally, it's listening interpersonally, and it's listening sociopolitically and in terms of those dynamics as well.
Beautiful. And you've repeated that 3-step inter, sociopolitical twice now. And so really going to take note of that. I'm aware that I've taken sort of the allotted amount of time that you've given us. So I'm going to just close with this 2 parting questions that I ask every single person that we interview.
Okay.
If you had a wish for the impact that Sidewalk could have on the world, what would it be? And what advice in general do you have for our volunteers in making that wish come true?
Okay, so a wish for Sidewalk Talk would be that it grows beyond the sidewalk, that I think it's an amazing, amazing project that has so much potential for giving people a space to connect across differences, and which is an act of social justice. Right? But those spaces need to extend into many, many places, in our kind of social world. So my wish would be, that can happen, and that these in some ways revolutionary acts of really listening to each other and connecting, attuning across differences, which is a revolutionary act, because we, particularly people who are not personally impacted, negatively by, those various isms, have a choice. They can kind of go about your lives and not attend to these things, and the day-to-day is not significantly impacted. So it is a choice to engage, and it's a revolutionary act to engage, to do something different than what our normal status quo is. So I would hope that those revolutionary acts of engaging across difference in meaningful ways and really listening can expand beyond the sidewalk, and using this as a model.
Thank you. And I feel like you've given us the advice in this whole interview, just in terms of holding the larger context and continuing to have the resilience to look at how we might be moving away from leaning into the conversation, both inter, and sociopolitically.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I feel so good to have had you on. I know I've been stalking you for a while.
Well, I'm glad you were persistent. You have been here, and just really a lot of props to you for your project and the power of that, and let it spread.
Well, and to give props to broaden the context to all the other people, because we have a group of diverse women that are running this thing now with 2,500 volunteers in 14 cities and 40 cities and 14 countries. So the thank you goes to not just me. It's not my project anymore, clearly.
Well, collective thank you for the energy that is out there for this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think people absolutely fundamentally want to connect with others. And so it's also, opening an opportunity that most of us wish for.
Yeah.
And just have trouble doing sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
If you guys want to check out, it's Dr. Shelly Harrell. She's a professor at Pepperdine, but your personal website has tons of great material under the printable section. So it's drsherryharrell.com. So go check it out.
Well, it's what is it? Shelly Harrell.
I still do it. I do it.
That's okay. That's okay. It's all good. It's all good. Shelly Harrell, PhD.com.
Great. Shelly Harrell, PhD.com. And I told Shelly that I was going to call her Sherry, and she said that her the reverend who married her called her Sherry and Shelly sometimes. But you know what? You're not paying me, and you had to pay him. So. All right. Have a good rest of your day, and thank you so much.